Welcome and good morning, everybody. It is exactly 9 o'clock. I hope you've had your first cup of coffee. My name is David Muniz-Sepanik. I am the head of business development and public affairs with Medicon Valley Alliance. I hope you will enjoy today's MVA Good Morning meeting webinar with MVA member Key to Compliance. We have an excellent lineup. We have an interesting topic, which is of course a very, very good point of departure. Apart from the actual content of today's meeting, I also personally hope that you will consider if the concept of Medicon Valley Alliance Good Morning meeting could be relevant for your company and your organization. If so, don't hesitate to reach out to me after this session. My email will appear on the final slide, and you will also find my contact info on Medicon Valley Alliance webpage, mva.org. I also strongly encourage you to visit our webpage, look at our event calendar. We have a number of good morning meetings lined up that you would hopefully find interesting. I would also encourage you to look into the Medicon Valley Alliance networks. As an employee with an MVA member company, you are able to join the MVA networks free of charge. It's included in the membership, and I strongly encourage you to do so. Back to today's session, which is of course the reason why you tuned in this morning. I have a few pieces of practical information before I hand over the floor or the screen to Åse from Key to Compliance. It's actually pretty straightforward, standard operating procedure. As you can see on the slide here, you're automatically muted. Use the chat for technical questions only, and then use the Q&A function for questions to our speakers. As you can see, the event is being recorded. I hope you're all right with that. And as you can also see, the final point, you will receive an email after this session with a link to the recordings and an opportunity to provide us with feedback. And if you're very enthusiastic about this presentation, as I hope you will be, feel free to share the recording with colleagues and others. Enough said on my part. After all, you didn't get up this morning in order to listen to me. So without further ado, I will hand over the floor to you, Åse. Here you go.
Hi everyone, I'm Åse Ek, and I work at Key to Compliance. Key to Compliance recently joined the Medicon Valley Alliance, and we're really thrilled to launch today's webinar. This is our first webinar since we recently become members, and it's on a really hot topic, the medical device regulation. All of you know it has been a long and winding road to get to the point where we are, discussing the regulations, seeing them getting developed. They were published, it's already 4 years ago since they were published, and now it's 4 weeks to go till the date of application. So it's an exciting time for everyone who is in the medical device business, and we're really happy to share our thoughts with you. So I'll just give you a few words about our company and then hand over to the my colleagues who will be presenting the different topics. So the name of our company is Key to Compliance. We were recently did a merger between two companies. It was a medical device consultant company named Symbiotech and Key to Compliance, who has their background in training and education. Those two companies merged during the autumn 2020. So the change is that we have now one name. It's we're all together in the company under the name Key to Compliance, part of the Symbiotech group. We also did some other changes, like adding clinical development to our portfolio. So we have an extended offering here, meaning that we can help develop customers throughout the entire development chain from ID to market and beyond. And the ID and the purpose with Keto Compliance is to make complex things easier all the way from ID to market, and to offer complete solutions based on our combined world-class expertise, and really help all our customers deal with possible challenges in regulatory and quality area. So the portfolio that we can offer is built on 5 interacting areas. We're active in regulatory affairs, quality assurance, biological evaluations and toxicology, clinical development, and last but not least, also training and courses. So this is the offer we have. Enough said about the organization. Now I will present my colleagues. So the speakers today is Britt-Marie Gustafsson, Robert Joseph, Emma Pedersen, and myself, and they will present themselves, each one of them, while doing their presentation. And we're here to talk to you about the MDR, and hopefully you will understand that if you have any needs in the medical device regulatory area, you can rely on us. So with that said, I'll say welcome to Britt-Marie.
Thank you, Åsa. I'm Britt-Marie, and I work at Regulatory Affairs team at Keto Compliance as a senior consultant for the last 1.5 years. I have a background as a technical file reviewer at the notified body. And so we will start talking about where it all starts, the intended purpose and the classification. Next slide, please. When you start update your technical documentation according to MDR, you will gain a lot of time by thoroughly going through your intended purpose and the classification before starting to update the rest of the documentation. First of all, you need to establish your intended purpose, since this will be the ground for your classification. And by all means, the remaining documentation, of course. Once you have decided about the intended purpose, you can then decide about the classification. And for non-legacy devices, that means devices that have not yet been CE marked under MDD, you would, of course, need to think about the qualification of the device as a medical device according to Article 2 before you do your classification. And for legacy devices, you also need to remember to include a rationale for why your device is qualified as a medical device, even though it would seem to be obvious. And this is because Annex 2 asks for this information to be included in the technical documentation. To establish these 3 points in the beginning, you will save a lot of time going forward, since other documentation as clinical evaluation, device description, etc., are depending on the classification and intended purpose. To most of you, this might seem obvious, but I have seen several examples of projects where the intended purpose is not established until later, and how it causes big problems with the update of other sections of the technical documentation. And you would also lose a lot of speed in your project. Also remember that your intended purpose needs to be consistent through your documentation. The intended purpose will need to be the same stated in the IFU as in the device description or in the clinical evaluation. And this is because your intended purpose will, as mentioned earlier, be fundamental for your technical documentation. Also, think about that it's important that the intended purpose does not list claims with your device that are not supported by the clinical evaluation. For example, it's a very big difference between to diagnose something or to aid in diagnose. And if you are too general with your intended purpose, you might have difficulties in finding the right level of clinical evidence. If you do have a legacy device and you change your intended purpose to include claims about your device that have not yet been CE marked under MDD, make sure that you have enough scientific evidence of those new claims. Next slide, please. I will also just mention, if your device today is an OBL, an own brand labeling, you need to make sure that you have a full technical file for your device according to Article 10. This is something that has been made more clearer with the MDR. For MDD, you could rely on the CE mark of the original equipment manufacturer, the OEM, that had designed and manufactured the device that you would then sell as your own brand. And even if you would have an agreement with your OEM to transfer the full technical file, you still need to implement the devices into your quality management system and also appoint the person responsible for regulatory compliance. This person would also need to be appointed by all manufacturers, of course. So do not forget to do that. And you would probably be asked this by a notified body in the beginning of the transmission process. MDR also includes devices without an intended medical purpose that are listed in Annex 16, such as contact lenses or dermal fillers for cosmetic purposes. Next slide, please. So moving on to risk management and post-market surveillance. Next slide. So Annex 2 is the annex which describes what you need to include in your technical documentation together with the post-market surveillance information in Annex 3. The requirements you need to fulfill is listed in Annex 1, the General Safety and Performance Requirement, the GSPRs, that is replacing the essential requirements from MDD. Annex 2.5 tells you that you need to include information referred to in Annex 1, GSPR 1, 3, and 8 in your technical documentation. And those GSPRs are related to the risk management and the benefit risk analysis. In practice, you would need to describe or state the method that you choose for compliance with these requirements, for example, the standard 4971. And then you would also need to list the evidence for compliance with that chosen method or standard. A question that is asked quite often and might probably not be new to those of you that have been around for a while is if a notified body would look at the compliance with a standard and why they do that, since standards are voluntarily to use. And the answer is that you could use any method of your choice to fulfill the GSPRs. However, it needs to be at least in line with the state-of-the-art method. And for risk management, this is 4971. And if you have said that you would comply fully to that standard in your GSPR checklist, you will probably also be evaluated for compliance with that standard during the technical documentation assessment from your notified body. Next slide, please. As evidence that you comply with the risk management GSPRs, you would need to include the risk management plan, the risk analysis, the risk management report, and also the risk management procedure, or a reference to that procedure, since it is a QMS document, not directly part of the technical documentation, but there are information that would be relevant to the notified body TD assessment of the risk management section. So the risk analysis itself should also contain the analysis from different parts, such as design, production, clinical, usability, and other areas such as electrical safety, biocompatibility, and software, depending on the device. I would say the risk management section is not that different in MDR from the MDD requirements, since it would probably still be 4971. That is the state-of-the-art method, even if the standard is not yet harmonized with MDR. MDR also talks a bit more about being an iterative process throughout the entire life cycle of the device with regular systematic updates, and also points out that the risk management plan needs to be established for each device and so on. But these have usually already been implemented if using 4971. The risk management requirements are more clearly defined in MDR compared to MDD, and the risk management is one of the core areas in the documentation, since it relates to so many other documents. Next slide, please. Risk shall be reduced as far as possible, still in MDR, and even though acceptable regions exist, as stated in the standard. So you need to, even if a risk is considered from the beginning to be acceptable, you still need to see if you can reduce that risk further. So you cannot just let go of a risk because it's in an acceptable region. In this case, the MDR and 4971 is not aligned, but the MDR requirements takes over that of the standard, of course. It is also worth noting that the GSPR 4 in Annex 1 states that the manufacturers shall inform users of any residual risks. Risks should be identified during the normal intended use and reasonable foreseeable misuse, and also if risks would arise from the mitigations themselves. This is something that is often forgotten in the risk analysis. Mitigations of a risk also need to be traceable to evidence of that mitigation. The priority of reducing risks is not changed since MDD, so the manufacturer need to eliminate or reduce risks as far as possible through safe design and manufacture in first instance, and secondly, take adequate protection measures, and lastly, provide information for safety and train users. And somewhere in the risk management file, the competence of the team need to be explained, and that all different competence and experience is covered in the team, including experience from using the device. This is important to be able to demonstrate that it is likely that all risks have been identified. This could then be concluded if there are relevant competence and experience included in the team. Next slide. The residual risks need to be analyzed to be acceptable in each individual risk, but also residual risks together. Are they still judged to be acceptable? A risk-benefit analysis need to be included and concluded that the benefits outweighs the risks with using the device. It's not enough with just a statement. You need to include an analysis of all the benefits and the residual risks and the impact it might have. It needs to be a discussion behind the statement. The risk management is to be updated when necessary during the whole life cycle of the product. Next slide, please. So after we have analyzed all risks and tried to have identified all kinds of risks related to our device, we will then see the risks based on factual evidence during post-market surveillance phase. And the post-market surveillance will be an important factor when the device is placed on the market, since that process will capture risks that might have been foreseen or discover that the probability and severity that we have during the risk analysis assumed to be a specific value has changed. So the post-market surveillance data will add realistic aspects of the risk management and also add on to the safety of the device. Annex 3 will tell us what to include in technical documentation regarding post-market surveillance. And do not look at Annex 2 and Annex 3 as two different technical documentation. It should still be the same technical documentation, even though they are divided into two different annexes. They do integrate, and they both need to be part of the submission to the notified body. It's also worth mentioning that it's a good idea to talk with your notified body if they have guidances or if they want you to organize your documentation in a special way. The technical documentation need to include a post-market surveillance plan, and for Class 2A, 2B, and 3 devices, a periodic safety update report, and for Class 1 devices, the post-market surveillance report. Manufacturers of Class 2B and 3 devices need to update their periodic safety update report at least annually. Next slide. The post-market surveillance plan needs to address the collection and utilization of available information, and in particular, the serious incidents, the FSCA, non-serious incidents, undesirable side effects, trend reporting, relevant specialist or technical literature, database registers, feedback complaint from users, distributors, and importers, publicly available information about similar medical devices. Next slide, please. The post-market surveillance plan needs to cover at least proactive systematic process to collect information. You need to plan how and what data you need to collect proactively and not only when it already has happened. Methods and processes to assess the data. What are you doing? What are you going to do with all the information? Indicators and threshold values in the use of the reassessment of benefit risk analysis and risk management. And you need to have methods and tools to investigate complaints and analyze market experience. How are you going to investigate and analyze these? And references to procedures on how to fulfill Article 83, 84, and 86, which would be the SOP. Systematic procedures to identify and initiate appropriate measures, including corrective actions. It could be your CAPA process, for example. And tools to trace devices for which FSCAs may be needed. Field safety corrective actions. Post-market clinical follow-up plan or justification for why not performing a PMCF. So this slide will end this part of the presentation. And now let's hear about the biological evaluation from my colleague Emma.
Thank you, Britt-Marie, and welcome, Emma, to talk about biological evaluation.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Emma Pedersen, and at Keto Compliance, I'm the Director for the business area Biological Evaluations and Toxicology. I have worked at Keto Compliance for half a year now, and my background is in biocompatibility testing of medical devices. So the topic of today is biological evaluation in relation to MDR, and I will focus on the importance of chemical characterization. Next slide, please. So the MDD contained very little details regarding the biological evaluations and relied completely on standards and guidelines, essentially. The MDR contains a lot more details, but essentially most of it were found in guidelines and standards. So to be honest, if you have kept up to date with the standard development and guidelines, there is not really so much new to do with MDR. Still, I want to highlight a few things. So the MDR is much more clear on how the biological evaluation relates to other processes. It stresses that it's an iterative process. So for your device, you must consider the biological safety for the entire life cycle. There are higher demands on equivalence, and there's an increased emphasis on planning and quality of data. And for today, I will focus on the higher demands on substances contained in and released from your device. And that is, of course, also reflected in the documents that you need to have in your technical documentation for the device. Next slide, please. So when talking about biological evaluations, you will inevitably talk about the ISO 10993 series. So that's a series of standards containing approximately 20 parts, where the first part is the framework for how to plan and conduct a biological evaluation, and the other parts are essentially the different tests that you can perform. There is a strong focus on risk management, and the purpose with the entire standard series is the protection of humans from potential biological risks arising from the use of medical devices. And here I also want to stress that the biological evaluation concerns devices that that has a direct or indirect contact with the body. Next slide, please. So the biological evaluation is a stepwise approach. So the very first step is to look at the configuration of the device, to look at the materials in the device, and also down to the detailed composition of the different materials. So that would also include, for example, colorants. So this is the step where you review in detail the documentation that you can get from your raw material supplier, for example, material safety data sheets, technical specifications, and various certificates. Then as a next step, I call it literature review. So this is where you look at the history of clinical use, or if you have, for example, existing biological safety data from a previous device or from the device under MDD. And after these two steps, you can actually come to the conclusion that you don't need to perform any testing. But if there are gaps, then you need to do testing on the device. And the very first step is the chemical testing. And after you have done the chemical testing, then you can proceed to perform biological testing, such as in vitro testing as a first step, or the last resort is to do animal testing. So as you see here, the chemical characterization is highly important, and that is described in part 18 of the ISO 10993 series. So that comes in two steps, both this first step where you review the information you have at hand and in performing chemical testing. I should also mention that physical characterization can also be important for some devices where, for example, the surface properties are important for the biological safety, such as implants or blood contacting devices. Next slide, please. So I don't want to scare you off with this kind of complicated table, but this is, if you have seen something, if you have worked with biological evaluation, I think you have come in contact with this table. So that is found in Annex A of ISO 10993 Part 1. So it has been modified in the latest version of the standard. It's from 2018. So it's a little bit more expanded compared to the 2009 version. I won't go through it in detail, but essentially you make a categorization of your device depending on the nature of body contact and the contact duration. So essentially, the more invasive the device is and the longer the body contact is, the more endpoints you need to consider in your biological evaluation. But one thing that is new with this 2008 version of this table is that physical and chemical information has been included in the table, and it's marked with an X to really stress that this is the step one, which you should do before you decide on any of the other tests in the table. Next slide, please. So Part 18 of the ISO 10993 series describes different kinds of tests that you can do for the chemical characterization. So there are tests for looking at the chemical composition. So that is what the material consists of and contain in total. What I think most people think of when you talk about chemical characterization testing are extractables and leachables testing. So that is what may come out of the device, which I illustrate here with the tea bag. So the distinction between extractables and leachables are that extractables are the substances that can come out of the device in a worst case or exaggerated laboratory situation, while leachables are the substances that will come out of your device during clinical use. There are also tests for looking at the structural composition of the device. So one of the few differences between the MDR and the ISO 10993 series is that MDR has an explicit focus on the amount of endocrine disruptors in the device. So chemical characterization testing would actually be one way to address this issue. Next slide, please. So when can I use chemical characterization? Well, of course, as a very basic tool to demonstrate the biological safety in line with both the ISO 10993 series and the overall risk management standard. You can use it to demonstrate the biological safety of a reprocessed device, and you can use it to get input to the toxicological risk assessment. And you can use it to support equivalence after a manufacturing change to, for example, a clinically established device, to a clinically established material of construction, or to a prototype device, which you have performed previous testing on. And you can use it as a tool for screening and selection of new materials. Next slide, please. So what I want you to take home is really that chemical characterization is the step one of the biological evaluation. It essentially consists of two parts: the sort of literature-based one, where you review the existing information, and testing. And this is something that you're expected to have in your MDR technical documentation. Thank you very much. And then I will hand over to the next speaker, Robert.
Yes, welcome, Robert, to talk about clinical evaluations and investigations on medical devices under MDR.
Thank you, Åse. I hope you all can hear me. My name is Robert Josef, and I work in the clinical development team at KITA Compliance as a coordinator for clinical investigations. And I've been with KITA Compliance for over a year and worked with clinical investigations, both in pharma and medtech, for over 12 years. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical evaluation and investigations for medical device under MDR. Next slide, please. So MDR will require a reclassification and re-registration of all medical devices currently on the market. Many devices will be reclassified to a higher device class, impacting their clinical data requirements. A new product should have a clinical strategy in place in accordance with MDR. And this usually is described as a clinical development plan, which is part of the clinical evaluation plan. MDR outlines new clinical data requirements for maintaining a certification for a medical device. And it also raises the bar for the level of evidence that is required for an initial CE marking. When the product is on the market, you need to continuously evaluate if the clinical data you have is enough to show safety and performance. And this applies for the whole product life cycle. And already CE registered medical device products have until 2024 to re-register under MDR, but the post-market surveillance, including a post-market clinical follow-up plan, needs to be in place already in May 2021. Next slide, please. So with MDR, more devices will require clinical investigations. And the biggest impact from MDR is on class 1 and class 2 products. Under MDD, it was possible to register your device based on literature data only and claim equivalence without access to any competitor data. But now under MDR, most likely you will need a clinical investigation on your device. If your product is innovative, you will need more data. If your product is well established or similar to other products, you can get some clinical data based on literature search to strengthen and complement your own clinical data. Under MDR, equivalence will be much harder to demonstrate. Devices need to be equivalent with respect to technical, biological, and clinical properties. And the manufacturer needs to demonstrate access to the equivalent device technical data. Also, under MDR, device studies should demonstrate clinical benefit. And this requires the clinical investigations to be designed with additionals and, in a lot of cases, complex endpoints, more intricate study setups, and potentially larger sample sizes. Next slide, please. So, clinical evaluation. This is defined as a systematic and planned process to continuously generate, collect, analyze, and assess the clinical data belonging to a device in order to verify the safety and performance, including clinical benefits of the device when used as intended by the manufacturer. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you different steps you should perform during your clinical evaluation. Next slide, please. So in order to help you with your clinical evaluation, there are different guidance documents which are listed on the slides, and there is also guidance in the MDR itself. And it starts at stage 0, where you establish or update your current plan to define the product and what data is needed for the product. And you need to create and or update the clinical development plan and consider the state of art to see if your product is innovative or well established. Once this is done, you will go to stage 1, where you identify and collect data. And this is relevant available clinical data. And you look at possible gaps you have. You perform a systematic scientific literature review and also consider all your own data that you have. It could be technical, usability data, preclinical or clinical data, or post-market surveillance data. In the next stage, you appraise and evaluate all the clinical data. And for this, you need to understand and look at the state of the art to understand what is the best practice in the medical field in order to know what to compare your product to. In the next stage 3, you analyze and weigh all relevant clinical data that has been selected in the process. Do you have any gaps? Revisit your plan and consider what is sufficient clinical data for your device and how can you look at the claims you've done and support them. And in the final step, you will document in a report. And in this report, it's very important that you also make sure that you write down your process, the results, and the rationale and justifications for all claims and statements in these reports. And if you've found any gaps, you need to generate new clinical data, and this can be done if you have a pre-market setting with a clinical investigation, or if it's a post-market setting, you can have a PMCF, a post-market clinical follow-up. Next slide, please. So this slide basically shows the different steps involved in a clinical investigation. And this is the standard for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, analysis, and reporting of a clinical investigation. Next slide, please. So clinical investigation, the MDR defines the clinical investigation as any systematic investigation involving one or more human subjects undertaken to assess the safety or performance of a device. And the aims with the clinical investigation is to fill the gaps that are identified in the clinical evaluation. You can collect initial data for a CE mark by investigating the safety and or performance of the device, or you could collect further clinical data in a post-market clinical follow-up, a PMCF study. And the clinical investigation is conducted by a sponsor, and the sponsor could be either the device manufacturer or it could be a principal investigator at the clinic. And you could either do a pilot study a pivotal investigation, or a confirmatory investigation. And it's also important to note that any clinical investigation will also need to comply with any applicable requirements of the National Competent Authority and ethics committees. And MDR also requires clinical investigations to be conducted according to GCP, good clinical practice. And MDR also directly references the ISO 14155 standard, which states to protect the rights, safety, and well-being of human subjects, ensure scientific conduct of the clinical investigation, and it also defines the responsibilities of the sponsor and the principal investigator. So this was all I had to mention about clinical evaluation and investigations. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Very good. And so now it's actually my turn for a little while, and I will talk a few minutes about things to think about when it comes to marketing and claims. And this is what is in the Article 7 of both MDR and IVDR, and is part of the mandatory requirements for all medical device manufacturers. And why is this important then? When you think about a device and placing a device on the market, you need to think about that you are delivering two different things. You are not only delivering a product, which is sometimes physical product, but it can also, of course, be a software. But you are delivering a product together with information about the product, and that information is available in different formats and in different places. Of course, it is the instruction for use primarily, but as a manufacturer, you probably is also communicating about your device through a number of channels, like your website, advertisement, could be trainings, and so on. And the information together with the product is what creates the user expectations. And the user expectations is also relating to how the clinical performance will be perceived, how the risk profile will look like, and will in the end have an impact on the safety of the device. So it's really important to think about that the combination of the device and the communication is what determines the user expectations, and the user expectations has a huge impact on the final safety and performance. So let's take a look at some of these text in the Article 7. So what it says here about claims is that in the labeling, so labeling is the information directly placed on the device or the package of the device. In labeling, instructions for use, when making available, so when making a transfer of the product, putting it into service, or in advertising of devices, it is prohibited to use text, names, trademarks, pictures, or other signs that may mislead the user about the intended purpose, safety, and performance. And these are very strong words. It's a short article. There is not much text in it, but it's really clear, and it's really important as a manufacturer that you spend time thinking about what the consequences of this is for your organization. How will you ensure that you meet the requirement of this claim, that there is nothing said in any of these communication materials that may mislead the user about the intended purpose, safety, or performance. It means also that the intended use, as defined in the instruction for use, must be known and implemented throughout all communication channels in the organization. So there is no opportunity, no flexibility in this any longer. There is no way to communicate anything outside the approved intended use. So further in the Article 7, it says it's also prohibited to mislead the user by ascribing functions and properties to the device, which it does not have. It's prohibited to create false impression regarding treatment, diagnosis, functions, or properties, which the device does not have. Another part here, number C, this is also really important. It is prohibited to mislead the user by failing to inform the user or patient of a likely risk associated with use of the device when used in line with the intended purpose. So we're not talking about risk that comes out of misuse or misunderstandings. We're talking also, but you also need to cover risks that are an integral part of using the device, and they need to be communicated to the users, just like Britt-Marie told you previously about summarizing residual risk and communicating them to the user. And finally, to sort of close any doors, it's said also that it's also prohibited to suggest uses for the device other than those that are stated to form part of the intended purpose for which the conformity assessment is carried out. So I think I really appreciate this article in the MDR and IVDR, because historically, like many of you know, it was fairly complicated to get an overview over all the regulations related to marketing of medical devices in Europe previously. They were sometimes in their national medical device regulation. You could sometimes have to look at marketing laws on advertisement, or there was nothing said, and so it has been a bit tricky to know what you could do and not do when it comes to advertisement and communication on medical devices. But with this article, it is crystal clear. So as a manufacturer, the way forward is to start implementing all of this in your quality management system and really ensure that you stick to this. And I also want to emphasize that this will be checked by the notified body. So if you have a device which is class 2 or 3, or let's say maybe the 1S, 1R, and so on, or M, the notified body will actually look at samples from your brochures, from your websites, from any communication available to verify that you are sticking to your approved intended purpose in the claims you make about the device. So the consequence here for the manufacturers is that there need to be an approval process which is very clear and well known and communicated in your organization, so that and the approval process should not cover only instruction for use. It should definitely also cover all the other channels, like training materials, advertisement, product leaflets, information on the website, even service manual, and even news published about your device. Any communication have to go through that approval process to ensure that you are not communicating anything that is misleading and is not aligned with the requirements in this article. So a thorough review and approval process is strongly recommended here to make sure that claims and any information related to indications, contraindications, warnings is, first of all, consistent and in line with the instruction for use and the approved intended use. Another thing that relates to this a little is that as a manufacturer, when handing over the device to the market, you must ensure that the users understand what is the medical device usage, and you must, as a manufacturer, also define what is the normal use, give instructions so that it is easy for the users and patients to use the device correctly. And you must also put efforts into identifying potential use errors, foreseeable misuse. And if you get aware of that the device is used outside the approved correct use, or outside what is covered in your risk analysis as use error or foreseeable misuse. It is important also that people in the organization are aware that you need to react on abnormal use and communicate that this is not part of our approved intended use. You may, of course, be in situations where healthcare personnel, where healthcare institutes decide to, on purpose, go on and use the device in a different way. And that is something in the end that you cannot, as a manufacturer, take responsibility for, and to some extent you can never influence. You may not hear about it, but when you hear about it, you are obliged to stick to your message, stick to your approved intended use, and communicate that what you're doing now is, this is on your own risk and it's not part of our approved intended use. So, and when market feedback gives you information about any unforeseen use errors, foreseeable misuse, let's say misuse that you did not foresee in your risk analysis, then that information must be fed back into your process and assessed to see how it impacts your risk analysis, and if you need to modify your instruction for use or communication, or even the design of the device. So feedback from market will and shall be used to reassess your technical documentation and your risk analysis. If you want to read more about this, there is a good standard, the 62366 standard on usability, where you can dive further into this. But my key message here is make sure your quality management system is set up to meet the requirements of Article 7. So now I hand over again to Britt-Marie.
Thank you. So from Åsa's key message to the key conclusions in your technical documentation. So the key conclusion is really to take a step back and look at the complete technical documentation and how it interacts. Next slide, please. As we have heard this morning, there are several parts of your TD that are connected, and you need to look at the complete documentation as a whole and not just as separate parts. In a large organization, this could be quite a big challenge. If we start with the risk management, then we identify all risks and we mitigate them as far as we can. We also include clinical risks and we align those in the risk management with the clinical evaluation. And in turn, the clinical evaluation provides scientific support of the performance of your device. And the clinical evaluation is therefore really the scope of what you can communicate to the user in marketing and IFU, as also earlier talked about as well. And also remember, as mentioned earlier, any residual risks need to be communicated to the user. And then you have the post-market surveillance that could reveal new risks, or you could detect trends. And through your CAPA system, you would then need to analyze those new risks in the risk management and make an update of your benefit risk analysis. And if those risks are also clinical risks, sorry, you would also need to update the clinical evaluation. And so it goes on. And you might also identify a gap in your clinical evidence, and for example, that you need to cover with doing a post-market clinical follow-up study that Robert told you about earlier. Except for these interconnections, you will also find connections when you look at all requirements that are listed in the GSPR checklist, and you need to make sure that you have evidence of fulfillment of those requirements in your verification and validation section. So your verification and validation section should need to include both evidence for conformity with the standards and methods in order to fulfill the GSPRs, and also conformity with your own requirements specified in your different requirement specification. And in your device description section, you would need to identify similar devices that you then need to use in your post-market surveillance process, where you proactively look for PMS data for similar devices. So there are a lot of different connections in your technical documentation that you need to be aware of. So the key conclusion is just take a step back and see that your documentation is interconnecting. I would say that it helps you to see the big picture and not just all the details. Next slide, please. So the next short topic is the QMS aspects and certificates. Next slide. Of course, you would also need to update your QMS so that it relates to the MDR. Article 10 outlines the minimum content of your QMS. So you need to update your QMS to ensure, for example, maintenance of the UDI and UDA-made data, the generation and maintenance of technical documentation, and do not forget all the interrelations that we just talked about, and proactive post-market surveillance, including post-market clinical follow-up. And also think about in what different stages of the life cycle of your device the technical documentation need to be updated and how to do that. It could be quite tricky sometimes to make sure that also the technical documentation is up to date. Your documentation need to be a living documentation. This is also need to be, of course, proportionate to the risk class of your device. The conformity assessment route, that means if you choose Annex 9, 10, or 11, or combinations of those depending on your risk class of the device as a way to demonstrate conformance with MDR. And if you choose Annex 9, it would be the conformity assessment route based on the quality management system and the technical documentation assessment. And it is the most similar to Annex 2 in MDD. And in that annex, the Annex 9, you will also find some references to the QMS that you need to be aware of. Next slide, please. So moving on to the certificates, I just have this last slide, and several manufacturers that already has devices on the market in compliance with MDD has had their MDD certificates renewed earlier to be able to use as much time as possible before they need to update their documentation to MDR, which is of course a way to have more time before you need to update the documentation. And I only have this one important thing to say, that this is a picture from the survey done in December 2020 by Team NB, and the workload of the notified bodies will be huge in 2024, as you can see, since a lot of certificates will run out that year. And the question is really if the notified bodies have capacity dealing with all of those transitions. So I recommend that first of all, you have a communication with your notified body, and that you transit as soon as you can, even if your certificate will allow you to wait. You will probably need to have a long time for your transition also. So this will now end my presentation. Åse, will you continue?
Yes. Thank you, Britt-Marie. So, and we all want to say thank you to all of you that listen, but it's not really, we're not really done yet. We also received a number of questions during the presentation, so we will try to answer them right now. Feel free to type questions while we're talking if you like to ask anything more. And in case you sort of go home, or maybe I guess many of you are already at home, but if when leaving this webinar, if you think of any other questions that pop up in your head, you are welcome to contact any one of us. The email addresses is the name. So mine is asa.ik@ketocompliance.com. So the same with all of us, obviously. It's also possible to use our info email, info@ketocompliance.com, if you have any other questions or like to get in contact. So with that said, we will look into some of the questions. Question number 1 here is, if your sales volume is quite low and also the number of complaints, how can you perform trend analysis for complaints to comply with the requirement for trend reporting? And with that question, I would like to answer that the Article 88 on trend reporting is not meant to focus only on complaints. I can see the point that if it is difficult to do statistics if when you're in a phase, an early phase, and sales volume is still low. It can also be that you're not in an early phase, but you have a type of device which is not sold in huge numbers for any other reasons, like more expensive and complex installations and so on. But nevertheless, the purpose of the trend analysis in Article 88 is not only to register complaints, it is to focus on also non-serious incidents, because complaints can be of a little bit different character. Some of them will be on less serious and some will be on more serious incidents. But the expectation in this article is to report non-serious incidents and also expected but unwanted, undesirable side effects. So what you need to do here is to not only look at complaints, but to identify the kind of information you need to monitor expected but undesirable side effects. And this will come out most likely of your risk analysis, or it can be an output from your clinical evaluation, or the combination of the two of them, that there is a potential that there will be side effects. And then your responsibility as a manufacturer is to put in place a system to monitor these side effects proactively, not only waiting for complaints to arrive to you, but to figure out how to proactively collect that information. So that means, and this is very much where the post-market clinical follow-up comes in. In your post-market clinical follow-up plan, you need to define the relevant data sources. What kind of information is relevant to my device to verify the risk assessment that I made? And this is what Britt-Marie also mentioned, that once you have finalized the risk management report, you need to continue building data into it by using your post-market surveillance, and PMCF is a part of your post-market surveillance. So this is really one of the key things with the regulation, that the focus on post-market surveillance is shifting from reactive surveillance, receiving complaints, to proactive, so to go out and actively look for information. So it could be that you need to start doing regular customer surveys. If you don't have big sales volume, maybe your plan could be that you will be in contact with the users for the first 3, 6, 12 months where the device is in the market, and you ask them for feedback. You may visit them and ask if you can observe them when using it, so that you can see how they use your device, just see how it's used in practice. Or if it is a software, maybe you collect data from that software, from a database that shows how it works. There can be different ways, and each manufacturer need to find their own methods to do this. But I want to emphasize that it's really not only complaints. There can be other pieces of information, devices being returned, or scanning the published articles and so on. But if there is sort of to stay in contact with the users, in one way or another and get their direct feedback is one of the key activities here. Let's see, I think there was, yeah. So that's my answer to that question. Is anyone else of you here have any other comments to that part? Britt, Maria, or Robert? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Next question is on marketing and claims, and this part about that you are obliged to communicate risk to the users, and this is an area where we need to do some thinking, really. So the question is, will the medical device promotion material now have to have something similar to an abbreviated product information like the one used in drug promotion, like a disclaimer listing potential adverse effects and so on, or adverse events? And honestly, this has not been clearly communicated yet. So it doesn't say that in your advertisement you have to have a disclaimer about risk. My understanding and my belief is that what is meant is that you need to communicate risks through the instruction for use and through your warnings and precautions section or contraindications, so the way you normally communicate risk. It will also for devices that have the summary of safety and clinical performance requirement, they will communicate risk in that SSPC document. So I have not seen an explicit requirement to put a disclaimer in any advertisement. I hope we will see some more guidance on that coming up. So that part, how will you do in sort of websites and advertisement? I can't say for sure if there will be an explicit requirement for that. I tend to think that it's more about being clear in your communication as part of the instruction for use. Another question. MDR states that a medical device should have a use before date in their labels. And the question is, does this also mean that component suppliers for medical devices should label all the components with an expiry date? Britt-Marie, do you have any comment on that part, if there is any requirement or expectation to label components with expiry date? I would tend to say no, because it is the finished device that should have an expiry date, and that should be built on what is the overall expected use before date or life cycle, lifespan of a device.
Yeah, I agree with you also. If you have a use before date, you would need to look into perhaps the stability and things like that for your device. And that use before date and stability should be done on the complete device. And if you have a device that would be instead an electrical medical device, that perhaps you would not have a use before date, but you would have a manufacture date instead, and you would then decide the lifetime of the device. You need to do an analysis of the components in your device as a whole. So.
Yeah, okay, good. So we're in agreement on that one. Another question, which I think also is relevant and important. When it comes to communicating residual risk, what is your view in selecting what risk to include as warning in the instruction for use? In a risk analysis, there may be a large amount of very low but still residual risk that if they were all listed in the IFU, the really important warnings would potentially not get sufficient attention. And I totally agree with that conclusion. And even if it says in the regulation you need to communicate any residual risk, I'm completely convinced that it doesn't mean that you should include your entire list of, because some of them will be almost theoretical or hypothetical risks, and they have been proven to be either really low severity and probability and or mitigated down to a sort of neglectable level. So I'm convinced that the intention of this paragraph is that you shall communicate residual risk that is of relevance to the user, things that are important for them to know when understanding how to use the device and the potential implication of using the device. So information they need in taking the decision whether or not to use the device, and then how to use it. So I'm totally sure this is what is meant. So that reading any residual risk means any residual risk which is of some significance and is value adding information for the user. Have there been any guidance or sort of statements on that from notified bodies, Britt-Marie, on that part, risks to be communicated?
No, I have not heard anything new about that, or how to interpret that, really.
So when reviewing an instruction for use, I suppose the expectation would not be to have the total hazard traceability matrix in the instruction for use.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the really important thing here is that the risk analysis itself need to conclude what risks that is really that really needs to be communicated to the user. But you cannot leave out anything that the risk analysis would tell is important.
Okay, yes. Okay, thanks. Now a question for you, Emma.
Yes.
The question is regarding biological evaluation. In case biocompatibility testing is considered needed, what is your view on testing of separate components, components that maybe are used in many different products compared to the whole product? So what is preferable, testing separate components or the whole product? And
I was about to say that there's always with questions related to biocompatibility, it depends. But I mean, the ISO 10993 series is very clear on that the biological safety should be demonstrated for the finished device. So that's the device that the patient meets. On the other hand, it's risk-based. So, I mean, if you have one material in your device, which is a very small part of the device, but that material has a much larger biological risks, then you might dilute that any toxic effect from that material out by testing the entire device. So it is a risk-based decision, and I mean, in this, you should also consider if you do a manufacturing change, it might be more wise to test parts separately when you change a material, raw material supplier, for example, that you have broken down the device in different parts, but you would still need to consider the interaction between those materials. So the part 12 of the ISO 10993 series was updated very recently. So the latest version of the standard is from January this year. And one of the new things that are added in this standard is a paragraph saying that medical device components with different type or duration of tissue contact might need to be extracted and tested separately. So that essentially agrees with what I said. It's a risk-based decision on how to test, but you still need to guarantee the safety of the final device. And then there is a question here: how should testing on aged products be considered? I mean, so far we don't really have the answer because we haven't had any feedback from notified bodies yet. But as a minimum, I think the biological evaluation should review stability testing, transportation testing, packaging validation testing, etc., to be consider if it's relevant for the biological safety. And ideally, you could, for example, in your stability testing, include endpoints related to the materials and the biological safety. But I wouldn't expect that you would need to perform biological tests, but I do think that chemical characterization can provide valuable input here. So ideally, if you could, in your stability testing, include some kind of chemical testing related to biocompatibility information in your endpoints, I think that would be good. But we don't have the final answer until the notified bodies have provided their input into this.
Okay, thanks. We have more questions. So one here is on marketing communication. If the manufacturer is using distributor, is the responsibility for marketing communication still the responsibility of the manufacturer? And this is an interesting question because the responsibilities of distributors has changed in MDR as compared to MDD. So distributors have a bigger responsibility than before to be aware of their own the requirements that are placed on them as distributor. So there is a specific section and a specific article on that. But certainly the manufacturer has some responsibility. They need, of course, to make sure that the communication that they hand over to a distributor is correct and approved and meets the requirements of Article 7. So the manufacturer must make sure that when they are using distributors, they provide the distributor with correct marketing information and emphasize the importance of using this communication and stick to that. But then there could be distributors that are, let's say, not first row, but second row or third row distributors. So it's not obvious that as a manufacturer, you will be in contact with all the distributors. And this is one of the reasons why the regulation now has put specific requirements on distributors. So as a distributor, what you're doing is you're receiving and handing over the device, receiving it from a manufacturer or another distributor and handing over it to an end user or another distributor. And they have responsibilities when it comes to making sure the device is CE marked, and it's also stated in another article that if a distributor makes other claims, so they have identified that situations when a distributor can be entering into the role of being a manufacturer. So one of these situations that is identified, I just don't remember the number of that article right now, but anyway, it says that if the distributor start to make other claims about the intended use of a device, if they change the communication and change the claim about the intended use, then they put themselves in the role of being a legal manufacturer. So altering the claims makes you the manufacturer. So that means they need to carry the responsibility of that communication as a distributor or a distributor that turns into being a legal manufacturer. So changing the communication and the intended use is similar to putting a new product on the market, and then they need to make a risk assessment on that, and then need to have valid documentation to support what they do. They need to do anything that the medical device manufacturer would do. So it's basically like treating the device as a component and then adding a new use to it. And then you need to do all the work that is required to justify that claim as being a manufacturer. So the manufacturer, to go back to the question, the manufacturer is responsible to make sure that they communicate things directly to the distributors, that what they hand over is in line with their approved intended use. But the next step with the distributor, they carry their own responsibility to understand their legal obligations and understand what happens if they make different claims. So we can sort of hold our thumbs and wish that distributors are reading the MDR. There could be other situations. Let's say that you are using your distributors to translate your instruction for use or something. Then, of course, then they are doing a service for you, and that service must be defined in a service agreement, so that then you, as a manufacturer, is still responsible to make sure that the translation is in line with the original document. But that's sort of a different situation if you're outsourcing things like training of customers or translation of instruction for use to your distributors. Then you should treat it as outsourced services. Okay, another question for you, Emma, again, on biological evaluation. Is it expected that every time a change of material is done that the biological evaluation report is revisited? Or can it be justified that it is not impacted?
Well, the short answer is yes. You need to redo it. I mean, of course, the review of with the new material or change in mind might come to the conclusion that the old conclusions are still valid, but still it needs to be documented, and you need to motivate why. So yes, the short answer is that yes, you need to redo it.
Okay. I think this was all the questions. Okay, we have one more. I'll try to squeeze that in before we hang up. How does a legal manufacturer control or assess risk management of a contracted manufacturing supplier? This is a question that comes up fairly often, and the answer to this is that you, as a manufacturer, the contract manufacturer does not have any legal obligations under MDR. That is sort of the short answer. So all of the responsibility lies with the manufacturer who have outsourced their production to this contract manufacturer. And you need, as a manufacturer, to understand, keep yourself informed about what are the potential risks related to the production process, and then communicate with your contract manufacturer how this should be controlled, and agree with them what kind of monitoring needs to be put in place in the production process, what kind of release test should there be to verify that and no risks are coming out of the production. You can certainly ask the contract manufacturer to do their own internal risk analysis of their production process, and then share with you the potential risks that they see, because most likely the contract manufacturer is the one that have the most the key inside information on where are the potential risks related to this type of manufacturing process. So they should give you that feedback. What risk do they see? And then you and them together need to agree on, well, what type of controls or what type of training does people working in that process need to have, and how will this be monitored? And so it's they should give you feedback so that you can make correct decisions as a manufacturer. and be in control of the risk of the outsourced process, and decide on. You also need to decide, of course, as a manufacturer, on what type of incoming inspection you do of devices received from that contract manufacturer. So the contract manufacturer can support you in your risk analysis, but the ultimate responsibility is with the legal manufacturer. Okay, we have maybe one more question. I think we sort of answered it already, but can a company claim something that is briefly mentioned in a device description, but not mentioned under intended use or indication? I would say that whatever you claim about your device cannot be in contradiction with what is described in the intended use or indication. So if it's briefly mentioned, what is mentioned in the device description should also be in line with the intended use and the indication. So it should not be possible that you have information in your device description that is outside the intended use. So all pieces of communication must be consistent, and so it means also that the intended use, one of the things you may do is to be a little bit more specific in defining your intended use, thinking about, did we address everything from target population to user environment to restrictions on combination with other devices, environmental factors, the how long can you use the device, in which tissue, and so on. Your intended use should be specific enough so that this cannot deviate. I hope that answers the question. And now it's very, very soon 10:30. So if there are more questions, we'll have to get back to them one by one after the webinar is ended. So this is it from us. And now maybe a last goodbye from David.
Yes, and thank you very much to you, Åse, Britt-Marie, Robert, and Emma. It's my job to wrap up this session and say goodbye, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, on behalf of Medicon Valley Alliance. I hope it's been time well spent. And as Åse just said, key to compliance is, of course, more than happy to answer any additional questions that might come up later today, later this week, later this month. As mentioned earlier, don't hesitate to reach out to Medicon Valley Alliance, to me, to us, if you have any questions regarding MVA, membership, events, networks. We actually have two networks that I think could be of interest to today's audience, the MVA MedTech network and the Medicon Valley Alliance R&D network. The last network actually happens to have a meeting, a webinar in about a month, the 20th of May. Feel free to sign up. And I guess that was it for today. Have a wonderful day and take care out there. Bye.
Bye-bye.